They called her No One. That was the word Aldrich Wren used when the tribute assessors asked him which Omega he had registered under the debt tithe, the night of Bloodfrost Eve in the year 1147. No one particular, he said. A girl from the lower pens. Not worth a formal notation. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about almost everything, as it turned out, though it took the assembled court of the Ashen Crown witnessing a woman's skin catch fire with golden light to prove it. This is the story of what happened between that first night and that last one, and of the ash she wore like armor, and of the king who saw through it in a single glance. The tribute pen sat at the eastern base of Voss Keep, carved into the bedrock of the mountain the keep had been built upon, low-ceilinged and cold in the way that had nothing to do with the season and everything to do with stone that had never once held warmth. In the year 1147, on the 23rd day of the month the old Pax called the Hollow, Bloodfrost Eve arrived with a sky the color of a bruise and a wind that drove ice crystals sideways across the frozen courtyard. 11 Omegas were assessed that evening for debt tribute placement. Brennan Starfall was the seventh name called, though it was not her name on the assessor's ledger. Aldrich had registered her as a tributary without lineage designation, a blank space in the column where a family seal ought to appear, and that blank space had been there for 5 years, ever since he had taken custody of her at 15, and never once filed the paper that would have said who she was. She had learned to live inside that blankness the way a person learns to breathe shallowly in a room with smoke. It cost nothing if you did not move, suddenly. Before she entered the tithe hall that night, she knelt at the trough behind the second pen and pressed her palm into the ash bucket that Mira kept there for exactly this purpose. Mira was the elder keeper of the tribute pens, a woman of 63 winters with a face like carved horn and hands that had bandaged more wounds than she cared to count. She had raised Brennan from 15 to 20 within these walls. She stood at Brennan's shoulder now and said nothing while Brennan worked the ash into the soft skin of her left wrist and the back of her left hand, pressing the gray into every crease until the faint luminescence that had begun 2 months ago was smothered entirely. It held last month, Brennan said, pulling her sleeve down. Last month the hall was darker, Mira said. They've added torchwork in the eastern gallery. 8 new brackets. She paused. The king will be in the assessor's chair tonight. Not a delegate. Brennan's fingers went still against her sleeve. Why? Because the High Warden requested it. Aldrich wants the whole court to witness the tithe and call it lawful. He has a political alliance riding on this tribute cycle. Foreign alphas from the Dunarath coast are in the keep. He wants the king present so the proceedings carry the crown's weight. Brennan pulled the sleeve the rest of the way down and stood. Then I stay in the middle of the line. Not at the front, not at the end. Mira caught her wrist, gently, and held it. The ash will hold, she said, and her voice had the specific quality of a person who had already calculated the risk and was reciting the conclusion to prevent herself from saying something more honest. Brennan nodded once and went to join the other 10 women in the corridor. The tithe hall was a long stone room with a vaulted ceiling and 8 iron torch brackets on each wall, exactly as Mira had said. At the far end, a curved dais held the assessor's table, 3 men in gray robes, a clerk with a ledger, and 1 chair set apart from the rest on a raised step. That chair was occupied. Kalen Voss, Alpha King of the Ashen Crown, sat with 1 arm resting along the chair's edge and the other hand flat on his thigh, and he watched the 11 women file into the room with the expression of a man doing something he had agreed to do and was already regretting. He was younger than the stone of his keep suggested. Not yet 40. The cold had put no particular cruelty in his face, though the office had put something else there, a kind of containment, as if every natural response had been routed through a long passage before it reached the surface. His hair was dark. His shoulder bore the gray and silver mantle of the Ashen Crown. He looked at the women as they entered, and he did not look away from any of them with unusual speed. Until the seventh one. Brennan felt the moment he saw her as a faint compression in the air of the room, the way a room changes when a fire is fed suddenly and the warmth moves outward. She was looking at the floor when it happened. She heard no sound, no intake of breath, no shift of weight in the chair. She felt only that the torchlight seemed to alter, to press against her left wrist with a warmth that had no business passing through wool and through ash alike. She did not look up. She took her place in the line and kept her eyes at the level of the clerk's table. At the table, Kaelin said nothing. The assessors called each name, each blank designation, each placement recommendation, and the clerk wrote it down. When the seventh name was called, a placeholder, tributary, no lineage, Aldrich spoke the labor assignment himself from his place at the assessor's table. Keep maintenance, lower hall, third rotation. The lowest of the service assignments, the one that meant cold flagstones and ash hauling and fires, late at 3 in the morning before any other soul was awake. Kaelin did not object. He said only, very quietly, "Note it." And the clerk noted it, and Brennan was assigned to the keep. She was aware, walking out of the tithe hall that night, that the king had looked at her wrist once more as she passed the dais. She was aware because she had felt the warmth again, sharper this time, like a coal pressed briefly against cloth. She kept walking and did not look back, and she told herself it was proximity to the torchwork, those 8 new brackets on the eastern wall. She almost believed it. If you want to know what happens when she stops being able to believe it, stay with the story. It gets harder before it becomes something else entirely. The keep's lower hall was exactly what the assignment had promised: cold, gray, populated before dawn by the low mutter of grates being scraped, and the particular silence of a building that held 300 people and had not yet asked any of them to be awake. Brennan learned its rhythms inside of a week. She laid fires in the 7 hearths on the lower corridor by 4 in the morning, collected ash in a gray ceramic bucket by 5, hauled water from the interior cistern by 6. The other 2 women on third rotation were named Osla and Fen, both older, both careful in the way the tribute assigned learned to be careful, thorough, and invisible by professional habit. It was Osla who told her, on the 4th morning, that the room at the end of the east corridor was not a storage room. "Don't lay that fire if anyone's in there," Osla said, not looking at her, scraping a grate with practiced strokes. "If the lamp is lit, come back an hour later." "Whose room?" Osla paused the scraping. "The king sleeps in the upper apartments. He works in that room. Or he did before." "Before what?" Osla went back to the grate. "Before he stopped being well enough to work at night." Brennan filed this away with the same careful neutrality she filed most information in this keep. Useful and possibly dangerous, neither to be acted on nor discarded. She laid the fire in the east corridor room on the 5th morning when the lamp was dark. The room held a work table, several sealed ledgers, a chair with a worn armrest, and a low cot pushed against the wall with a gray wool blanket folded on it. The hearth had not been lit in several days. The ash in the grate was old and cold. On the 7th morning, the lamp was lit when she arrived. She turned to go. She had already turned when a voice said, from inside the room, "The fire. You can lay it." She hesitated, which was a thing she almost never did. And then she pushed the door open the rest of the way and came inside. He was sitting at the work table with a document open in front of him that he was not reading. She knew he was not reading it, because his eyes came to her the moment she entered, not after, not during, and they stayed there for 2 beats longer than courtesy required. Then he looked back at the document. She laid the fire. She did not speak. She was aware of the ash on her left wrist, the sleeve pulled low, the specific angle of the torch nearest the work table and how much light it threw. She worked quickly, stacking the wood with the particular efficiency that comes from doing the same task 300 mornings in a row. When she rose to leave, he said, "You favor that wrist." She went very still, facing the door. "You favor it against warmth," he said. "You've been angling away from every heat source since you entered the room." She turned to face him. He was watching her with an expression she could not entirely categorize. Not hostile, not soft. Somewhere in the passage between the two. His left hand lay on the table, and she noticed for the first time that the sleeve of his shirt was pushed to the elbow despite the cold, and that the skin of his forearm had a faint mottled discoloration running from the inner wrist to the crease of the elbow. Old bruising laid over older bruising, the specific color of wolfsbane damage left too long untreated. She knew that color. She had seen it in the healer's texts Mira kept in the penkeeper's room, the ones that went back 40 years, the ones that described how slow-acting wolfsbane worked through soft tissue when administered in trace amounts over weeks. 3 months, those texts said, before it reached the blood in concentrations that could not be walked back. She looked at his arm. He let her look. "How long?" she said. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man deciding whether to answer. It was the silence of a man surprised to have been asked a question he had not expected anyone to be able to formulate. "Since the end of the harvest month," he said. She counted backward. 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks to work with, if the dosing had not accelerated. "Who knows?" she said. 3 people in this keep," he said. "Now 4. She should have said something careful. She should have retreated behind the neutrality that had kept her intact for 5 years. She said instead, "The treatment requires ground limestone root and silver-cleared river water. The limestone root grows in the eastern gorge. I know where it is. I know how to prepare it." The expression that moved across his face then was not gratitude. It was something more controlled than gratitude, and more fractured than composure, a thing the mask had not been built to accommodate. "Why?" he said. One word, flat, carrying 4 or 5 questions at once. "Because no one else in this keep has told you what they know," she said, "and because you are going to die in 6 weeks if someone does not." She left the room, the ash still on her wrist, the fire burning well behind her. She came back the next morning with the first of the limestone root, dried and powdered, wrapped in a piece of cloth she had cut from the hem of her spare work shift. She set it on the work table without ceremony. He looked at it for a moment, then at her. "You went to the eastern gorge before 4 in the morning," he said. "The gorge is 2 miles out. I went at midnight. Alone. The other assignment was the fires." He said nothing for a moment. Then he rolled his sleeve up and laid his forearm on the table. Over the following weeks, a rhythm formed between them, built on the narrow frame of what was medically necessary and the wider frame of what could not help but accumulate in a closed room over a dark winter. She ground the limestone root with a ceramic pestle he found in the work table's lowest drawer. She prepared the silver-cleared water by running river water through a cloth packed with ash-scrubbed iron filings, a technique from Mira's texts that removed the silver trace that aggravated wolfsbane damage. She applied the compound to his forearm in careful passes with a clean cloth, and she watched the discoloration slowly, over weeks, begin to recede from the inner wrist toward the elbow's crease. He talked some mornings because the treatment lasted 20 minutes, and silence for 20 minutes requires effort neither of them wanted to spend. She learned that the wolfsbane had been introduced in a heated wine at the Dunarath Alliance dinner 6 weeks before the tithe, that he had identified the source within 3 days and said nothing because the political cost of accusing the Dunarath delegation without evidence was too high, that Aldrich had arranged both the dinner and the delegation's welcome, and that Kaelin had not yet been able to determine whether Aldrich knew the wine was poisoned or had simply been too careless to prevent it. She learned these things because he told her, and she did not pretend he had not told her. She answered his questions with the same plainness when he asked them, where she had come from, what she remembered of her family before Aldrich's custody. She told him her father's name had been Starfall, which was a name she had never heard anywhere in the keep's records, and that her mother had died when she was 3, and that Aldrich had told her at 15 that her family line had been erased from the tributary registers for debt defaults, which was the explanation he gave for why there was no entry for her anywhere. On the 22nd morning, Kaylin looked at her left wrist and said, "The mark is warm even through the cloth." She stopped the circular motion of the pestle. "I know what it is," he said. "I felt it the night of the tithe. I felt it when you crossed the hall." She set the pestle down. The room was very quiet. The fire she had laid that morning had burned down to a steady, low glow. "I don't intend to act on it," he said. "I am telling you because you have not asked me to lie to you, and I am not willing to begin now." She looked at him across the work table. His arm was still extended, the treatment half finished, the discoloration almost gone from the wrist, and retreated now to a small gray patch at the inner elbow's crease. "I know what it is as well," she said. "I have known since the 3rd morning in this room." The thing that passed between them then had no name either of them reached for. She picked up the cloth and finished the treatment. Aldrich learned of it on a Tuesday, though Brennan did not know this until later. He had a network of informants among the keep's service staff, 2 of them on the lower hall rotation, and the informant in question had not heard their conversations, but had seen Brennan entering and leaving the East Corridor room at hours outside her assigned duties, and had noted it, and had written it in a small folded paper that passed through 2 hands before reaching Aldrich's. He acted within 3 days. The treason charge was a precise and beautifully constructed piece of malice. A tribute assigned Omega found to have gained irregular access to the king's private quarters was, by the keep's standing law, liable to a charge of attempted influence by unauthorized proximity, which was a category of treason that had been written into the law 3 generations ago to protect alphas from unregistered bond manipulation. The law did not require proof of intent. It required only documented irregular access and a warden's affidavit. Aldrich had both by the morning of the 3rd day. Brennan heard the warrant read in the lower hall at 6 in the morning, before the fires in the first 4 hearths were even fully lit. Osla caught her eye across the corridor and held it for 2 seconds, which was a warning Brennan understood without needing the words. She was taken to a holding room in the keep's secondary wing, a narrow stone room with a bolted door and a single ground-level window that showed her the gray underside of a winter sky and the frozen courtyard below. She sat on the stone bench and put her ash-covered wrist against the cold wall and thought about the 6 weeks she had bought him, about the discoloration retreating, about the limestone root drying in the cloth under the work table where she had left it that morning. She thought about Mira, who knew where the East Corridor room was and had never asked. By mid-morning, Mira came. Not through the door, which was bolted from outside. Through the ground-level window, which was too small for most adults, but had been built at a height and width that the keep's original plans, which Mira had spent 40 years memorizing, showed as a secondary service access for waste ash removal, unbolted on the exterior. Mira pressed a folded oilskin packet through the gap in the window and said quietly, through the stone, "I have had this for 4 years. I was waiting for the right moment, and it appears this is it." Brennan opened the packet against her knee. Inside was a single page of heavy keep vellum, age-darkened at the edges, bearing an entry in the tribute register's formal hand, dated 40 years prior. The entry was for a bloodline called Starfall. The entry had been crossed out with 2 strokes of a red pen and annotated in a different hand with a single word: suppressed. Below the suppression notation, in the same second hand, was a different name: Wren A., authorized custodian. Aldrich's initial, Aldrich's authorization. A lineage suppressed by the man now charging her with treason. "He buried it the year before your father was born," Mira said through the stone. The Starfall line held a seat at the Tributary Council before Aldrich's family rose. He could not have them recovering that standing. When your father died, Aldrich took custody of you and filed nothing, because a registered Starfall would have had council rights, and he could not afford that. Brennan folded the vellum very carefully and pressed it flat against her chest, inside her work shift, against the skin of her right side, where it would stay warm. The council convenes for Aldrich's treason charge at the hour of the Bloodfrost Watch tonight, Mira said. The full assembly. The foreign alphas are still in the keep. Aldrich wants this done publicly so the Dunarath delegation sees that he controls the court. Brennan looked at the narrow window, at the gray sky, at the frozen courtyard where a thin line of keep staff were crossing with their morning loads, breath fogging, heads down against the wind. The full assembly, she said. Every ranking member of the court, the council elders, the delegation, the king. Brennan understood what Mira was telling her. The same room, the same witnesses. The room where Aldrich had arranged for the tithe to give him everything he needed, now arranged to give him her. She pressed the vellum flatter against her ribs. He will still be in his chair, she said. He always takes the assessor's chair for formal proceedings. He will, Mira said. And the High Warden's seal and his formal declaration will be on the clerk's table, and he will expect you to be brought in already sentenced. Brennan thought about this for a long time. Long enough that Mira, through the stone, said her name once, quietly. Tell me how to get word to him, Brennan said. Not through anyone who reports to Aldrich. There was a pause. Then Mira gave her a name, a single name, the keep's old physician, who had been in the East Corridor room once and owed Kaelin a long-standing debt of discretion. The physician's room was in the north wing. Mira knew which window. Brennan had been wrong about one thing. She had thought he would not be ready. She had thought Kaelin's choice, when it came, would be forced and incomplete. A man not yet whole enough to spend what it would cost. She had not fully accounted for 6 weeks of limestone root and a body beginning to remember its own strength. The Bloodfrost watch hour came with a sky gone ink black and a courtyard filmed with fresh frost. The tithe hall had been reopened for formal council proceedings. The 8 iron torch brackets on each wall blazed again. The assembly filled the room. 43 named members of the court, 7 elders, 4 Dunarath delegation alphas in their coastal gray, standing in ranked order from the dais to the door. Brennan was brought in by 2 keep wardens at the first watch bell, hands unbound because a tribute assigned Omega was not considered a physical threat, only a social one. She was placed at the center of the floor before the assessor's table. Aldrich sat at the table's head in the High Warden's formal chair, his seal on the table before him, his face carrying the specific expression of a man who has arranged the outcome and is now performing the formality. Sarah Vane stood to his left, the court's ranking she-wolf, a woman who had made her contempt for tribute-assigned Omegas into something approaching a professional position. She looked at Brennan in the center of the floor and said, to the room in general, "She doesn't even bother to dress for a formal proceeding. Ash on her sleeve at council." A ripple of sound went through the assembly. The particular sound of a crowd offered something to look at. Brennan did not look at Sarah. She looked at the assessor's chair on the raised step, which was occupied, and held her hands very still at her sides. Aldrich opened the proceedings with the treason charge. He read it with the smooth precision of a man who had written it himself and knew every word. The unauthorized access, the unregistered proximity, the bond manipulation statute. He read the 2-line affidavit from the informant on the lower hall. He noted the irregularity of her access over a period of 3 weeks and named the relevant section of the standing law. The room was quiet. Aldrich set the document down and said, "The charge requires the king's formal acknowledgement before sentencing, my lord." He looked at the assessor's chair. Kaelin Voss rose from it. He did not look at Aldrich. He looked at the center of the floor, at Brennan, And the thing in his expression had come the rest of the way through the passage now, all of it at the surface, nothing behind the glass. Before this assembly acknowledges any charge, he said, I am going to name what this proceeding actually is. Aldrich's face went through a rapid, controlled sequence of adjustments. My lord, the formal order of proceedings requires. The formal order of proceedings requires a king who does not know what his high warden has buried in the tributary register for 40 years. Kaelin said, I have seen the register entry. I have held the vellum. I know the hand that wrote the suppression notation, and I know the initial below it. The room moved. Not physically, collectively, the kind of movement that lives entirely in the quality of attention, 43 people and 4 foreign alphas turning toward the dais. Aldrich said, very carefully, that document's provenance cannot be. Her name is Brennan Starfall, Kaelin said. The Starfall line held a seat at this tributary council before your family arranged to erase it. The lineage entry was suppressed by your authorization, 40 years ago, in a register you have controlled since your appointment. The woman you have charged with treason for entering my private quarters is the woman I summoned to those quarters, whose knowledge of slow poison treatment I solicited, and whose lineage your own hand erased from the record to keep her from the standing she was born to. Sarah Vane made a sound from Aldrich's left side. Not a word. Just a sound. You would burn her, Kaelin said, still to Aldrich, still with that controlled, unveiled surface, for knowing what you did not want known. You would use my own court's law as the instrument. He looked, for the first time, at the Dunarath delegation. This is the man who arranged your welcome to this keep. Consider what he arranges. Aldrich pushed back his chair and stood. My lord, you are under the influence of an unregistered bond, and the court must. The court sees what it sees, Kaelin said. He stepped down from the dais. The room pulled back from him the way a tide pulls back from a stone, not in fear but in the specific acknowledgement of a thing that has chosen to move. He crossed the floor to where Brennan stood, and he stopped beside her. And he said, quietly enough that only she could hear it, I told you I did not intend to act on it. I have since revised that. He took her left wrist in his right hand and turned it upward. The ash had dried and cracked over the course of the evening, the warmth beneath it working at the edges for hours. When his fingers closed around her wrist, the last of the gray coating split and fell away in fine powder, and the light that had been pressing at it for 2 months came through all at once. Gold shot through with white, running up the inside of her forearm in branching lines that the torches on the eastern wall threw back as double brightness. The room went entirely still. Not the assembled crowd kind of still, not the formal proceeding kind. The still of 43 people and 4 foreign alphas confronting something the body registers before the mind names it. One of the Dunarath alphas took a single step backward. An elder at the far wall put his hand flat on the stone behind him. Sarah Vane said nothing. Her mouth was open and nothing came out of it. The light from Brennan's forearm threw gold across the flagstones, across the table where Aldrich's seal sat, across Aldrich's face. He looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he arranged specifically to prevent and failed. Kaelin did not look at the light. He looked at Aldrich. You are relieved of the High Warden's seal, he said, by my decree, before this assembly, in the presence of the Dunarath delegation as witnesses. The charge against Brennan Starfall is dismissed. The 40-year suppression of the Starfall lineage entry is hereby reversed. The tributary council seat is restored. He paused. You will be escorted to the outer ward and held pending a formal exile decree. The seal stays on the table. Aldrich did not speak. He looked at the light on his hands for one long moment. Then he sat down heavily in the High Warden's chair, which seemed, suddenly, like a very small piece of furniture. Sarah Vane's knees hit the flagstones first. Not from choice, Brennan thought, but from the specific failure of a body whose composure has used up every reserve. She went down with a sharp sound of stone against bone and stayed there, her head not quite bowed, her eyes on the floor, not able to look up. The council elders followed in sequence, not in the sharp collapse of surprise, but in the deliberate formal descent of men who had spent their lives reading what was irrevocable and were reading it now. Their knees met the flagstones one by one. The Dunarath Alphas did not kneel. It was not their court's custom, but the oldest of them inclined his head in a specific deep angle that his culture reserved for recognized bloodlines and held it for 5 seconds, which was longer than courtesy required. The assembly kneeled, all of it, all 43, the ranked members and the standing wardens at the door, and the clerk with the ledger still open on the table before him, and the 2 keep wardens who had escorted Brennan in and were now on their knees in the doorway with the cold of the corridor behind them. Brennan stood in the center of the floor with the light still running up her arm, and she felt it. All of it. The weight of the room pressing down and then lifting in the same motion, the way a chest feels after a long breath finally let go. She felt Kaylin's hand warm around her wrist, and she felt, for the first time in 5 years, the specific sensation of a floor that was not moving beneath her. She thought, with some part of her mind that was still the girl who ground limestone root at midnight and laid fires before dawn, that she should probably say something formal. Something appropriate to the occasion. She looked at the vellum she had taken from inside her work shift and placed on the assessor's table as she passed it. Mira's 40-year document, the starfall entry with its crossed lines and its small handwritten initial, lying now in the torchlight beside Eldrick's abandoned seal. She looked at Kaylin. "The limestone root treatment needs 2 more applications," she said. "The inner elbow crease." Something crossed his face that had nothing to do with composure and nothing to do with the mask. A thing that had been working its way through the passage for 6 weeks and had now arrived. "After," he said, and his voice carried the specific quality of a man who has given up more than one thing tonight and does not regret any of it. In the days that followed, the keep settled into a new arrangement in the way that large stone structures settle, not quickly, not without sound, but permanently. Aldrich's formal exile decree was issued on the 3rd day, before the Dunarath delegation departed, so that they carried the news south with them and it would not need to be explained later. The Dunarath alliance Aldrich had spent 3 seasons constructing was not, as Brennan had expected, destroyed by the proceedings. It was renegotiated, on terms that did not require a warden's seal as security. And the oldest of the 4 alphas said privately to Kaylin that a king who could read a poisoned cup and wait for the evidence was a king worth dealing with. Aldrich's departure was without ceremony. His seal stayed on the assessor's table. The High Warden's chair in the tithe hall stood empty for 6 days before a new appointment was made, and the 6-day gap was deliberate, Kaylin told Brennan, because a room that has held a seat of power benefits from a period in which people can look at the empty chair and remember that the seat is not the person. The Starfall lineage entry was restored to the tributary register in full, the red crossing out struck through in black, the suppression notation voided. The council seat was not a ceremonial restoration. The council met on the 10th day after Bloodfrost Eve with a full quorum, and Brennan sat in the seat that had been empty for 40 years, beside an elder named Corvin, who had been a young scribe during the original suppression and had said nothing at the time and had carried that silence like a stone in his chest ever since. He told her this on the morning of the meeting, in the corridor outside the council chamber, unprompted, with the specific relief of a man putting something down. She told him she was not particularly interested in the original silence. She was interested in the 41st year. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "Yes," and held the chamber door open for her. On the 14th day, Mira appeared at the door of the East Corridor room. Brennan had been expecting her, because Mira always appeared when things were settling, to look at what had settled, to make sure it was the shape she had worked toward. She stood in the doorway with her hands folded in front of her and looked at the room, the work table, the hearth with a good fire in it, the ceramic pestle on the cloth beside the window, and at Brennan and at the king at his table reading a document he was actually reading this time. She said nothing for a moment. Then she walked to Brennan and took her left arm and turned the wrist upward. The mark ran from just above the pulse point to the inner crease of the elbow. Gold and white veined, perfectly clear, nothing over it. Brennan had stopped applying ash to it on the morning after the council session. The skin beneath it was warm to the touch, and had been warm since Bloodfrost Eve. Mira looked at it for a long time, longer than looking required, in the way of a person re-examining something she has protected for years and is now, at last, permitted to simply see. "Good," Mira said, and set the arm down and turned to the door. "Mira," Brennan said. The Elder Keeper stopped. "Thank you for the bucket," Brennan said. A pause. "Don't thank me for the bucket," Mira said. "I would have preferred you never needed it." But there was something beneath the words that was not rebuke. She walked out, and her steps in the corridor were, Brennan thought, slightly lighter than usual, or perhaps she was simply listening more carefully, now that the hall was no longer somewhere she had to be afraid. In the tithe hall, the vellum with the starfall entry and the crossed-out suppression had been returned to the Tribune Register, restored to its original page. The clerk had filed it under the proper date, 40 years prior, corrected as of the 14th day of the Hollow month, year 1147, with the High Warden's seal replaced by the King's mark in its margin. Kalen finished the document he was reading and set it aside and looked across the work table at Brennan, who was grinding the last of the limestone root, because 2 applications remained and she intended to finish the work she had started. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a steady red glow. The window showed a sky beginning to lighten at its eastern edge, the deep blue-gray of a winter dawn coming in after a long night. Brennan tipped the ground limestone root into the cloth and shook it even and looked up. He had his sleeve already rolled to the elbow. The last gray patch at the inner crease of his forearm was fading to a pale line, almost colorless against the skin. A week more, and it would be gone entirely. She dipped the cloth and worked in the slow circular passes she had done 30-something times now in this room, and his hand lay open and still on the table's edge, and her mark was warm against the cloth and warm against the air, not hidden, not suppressed, just present in the way of something that had always been real and was now simply permitted to be seen. Outside, the frozen courtyard held the blue of early morning. Somewhere in the lower hall, Osla was beginning the first grates. Somewhere in the eastern gorge, the limestone root grew at the water's edge where it always grew, patient and unremarkable, in the cold. His hand, when she set the cloth down, turned upward. She put hers in it.